The 1920s in Michigan was a very interesting time. It was the introduction and rise of the automobile. The main form of long-distance transportation was still the railroad, and the age of radio was just beginning, and it wouldn't take on a life of its own until the 1930s. And the main form of medium of entertainment was still the local newspapers. And at Christmas time, stories were published still in local newspapers about Christmas. And if you've watched some of my other videos of Christmas stories from the 1800s and early 1900s, you'll see that in the 1920s, the stories are changing just slightly, but still the same common theme of Santa Claus and Christmas revelries and family and going home for Christmas are still common threads throughout all of these stories. So join me as I take you through Michigan Christmas stories from 1921 to 1929. The Christmas season is such a wonderful time. It's a time of family getting together. It is a time for celebration and cheer and looking back at the year. And this year, as I produce this video, we've had quite a winter snowstorm that came in, and I decided that I would make some more Christmas story videos from Michigan's past. And this collection of stories were published between 1921 and 1929 in Michigan newspapers. And they're all poems and Christmas stories from that era. The first collection of stories comes from the newspaper called the Owasso Times, and these were all published on December 23rd, 1921. The first story is The Glad Yuletide, written by Darius Earl Maston. Talk about the joyous Maytime with its blossoms on the trees, with the strumming and the humming of the little honey bees, rioting in all the sweetness of the orchard over there, and the summer breezes talking little love words everywhere. Yet there's nothing more heart-thrilling in the Yuletide's silver chime, calling all hearts to be merry for the joyous Christmas time. Oh, the sweetly scented summer with its breezes soft and mild, and the laughing little brooklet dancing like a happy child, and the shimmer of the sunshine over all the happy land, tousled grasses in the meadow, leafy wood so green and grand. Make you think there's nothing grander. Summer is just super fine, but it doesn't stir your pulses like the happy Christmas time. Ah, the happy days preceding when there's secrets everywhere, dove light beaming in all faces, drowning out all petty care. There's a love and lilt and lightness that no poet has expressed. There's harmony and gladness that the summer never guessed. There's a something more appealing in the Yuletide's silver chime that makes every heart beat happy for the joyful Christmas time. And in this same edition of the Owasso Times on December 23rd, 1921, there is a short poem called The Christmas Watch, and it refers to a sailor's watch on a ship. The Christmas Watch. Save for the engine's rhythmic beat, the ship is wrapped in dreams. Behind it on the darkened deep, a wake of silver streams. I walk my lonely watch and hear the voices of the brave. Old Vikings chant their sagas, wild in roar of wind and wave. God seems a little nearer here, far out upon the grand blue sea than when I used to keep my Christmas on the land. For so it seems to me, the stars are shining angel eyes that watch above the mariner from stations in the skies. The next piece is a story that was published in the same edition of the Owasso Times on December 23rd, 1921, and it was written by Eleanor E. King. It's called Christmas Eve in the Kitchen. In the kitchen of an apartment building in the city was seated a large, husky man with a little girl of about 7 on one knee and a boy of perhaps 6 on the other knee. "But, Grandpa, I don't see why Santa Claus doesn't come," said little Doris. "We have waited so long out here in this old kitchen." At this, Master Fred laboriously climbed down from his grandpa's knee and ran over to the kitchen door and then to the window. "Isn't it disgusting, Grandpa? I can't even see him coming." "Well, you know," said Grandpa as Fred climbed back upon his knee, "Santa Claus was a little boy once himself, and he knows how impatient little boys are. He has a hard time, though. Every year, he has more boys and girls to bring toys to than he had the year before." "But, Grandpa," said Doris, "I never knew Santa Claus was ever a little boy." "Oh, yes," asserted Grandpa firmly. "Once upon a time, a group of fairies were playing around in the open place under some trees, and they found a little baby asleep. They took the baby to their queen. The fairies loved the little baby, so they begged the queen to let them keep him and take care of him. The queen consented, and the little boy, Claus, thrived under the care of the fairies." "Shh! Grandpa, I think he's coming," interrupted Fred, as he again climbed down and ran to the window. "Nothing doing," he said, with much disgust, and gave a signal with his arm like the flagman does when telling a train to go. Grandpa obeyed the signal and continued. He lived under the care of the fairies until he grew to be quite a man. Then the queen ordered her fairy workmen to build Claus a hut, for he was a mortal and could not live the way the fairies did any longer. Claus had lots of time when he got into his new home, and he occupied it by carving things. The fairies had taught him how to whittle, and he began making all sorts of toys. There was a village some distance from his hut, and every time he heard of a little boy or girl down in the village who was sick, he took them one of his little toys. The children grew to like him so much. After a while, he became acquainted with so many children that he found it hard to get around and see them all so often. He decided that he would work all year making toys and then go around and find out which of the children had been good and leave them presents. When the fairies heard of this plan, they were delighted and gave Santa Claus 4 reindeer and a sled to help him out. After many years of this hard work, Santa Claus began to slow, that he was growing old. The fairies realized that Santa Claus was immortal and would die, so Santa Claus has come, someone shouted from the front room. "Hurry and finish, Grandpa. What did they do?" queried Doris nervously. "They gave Santa Claus everlasting life so that he could make little children happy always," finished Grandpa. "Oh, I am so glad," said both of the kitties. "Now, to see what Santa brought," said Grandpa, and all 3 made a rush for the parlor. And that's the end of that story. This next piece ran in the same edition of the Owasso Times on December 23rd, 1921. It's called Why the Christmas Kisses. Osculation, allowed by custom, celebrates one of the most charming events in tradition. Why should men kiss girls who stand under the mistletoe? Because they like it, and because customs allow it. Every kiss under the mistletoe, however, is a kiss which celebrates one of the most charming events in Christmas tradition. The romance goes back to the days of the gods of Scandinavia, when Baldur the Beautiful was shot by Loki, the spirit of evil, with an arrow of mistletoe. But his mother, Venus of the North, restored him to life by saluting with kisses all who passed beneath a branch held aloft in her hand. Thus, it became an emblem of love and happy celebration. Ancient races held the plant in great veneration particularly the Druids, who went in procession into the forest to collect it. After New Year's Day, it was distributed among the people as a sacred and holy plant. If any part of mistletoe touched the ground, it was regarded as an omen of impending evil. And that is the end of that story about why the Christmas kisses. This next story is a theme that sort of passes through a lot of the old Christmas newspapers. It's somewhat of a sad one, but I'm going to read it. It was also included in the Owasso Times on December 23rd, 1921, and it's called "And the Postman Passed the House." It was written by Mary Graham Bonner. It was Christmas morning. Old Hiram Palmer sat by the window, waiting for the postman. Christmas Eve had been rather bleak. He had seen from the window groups of people passing from time to time, hurrying, smiling, such gay, happy people. Hiram was old, too old. He had outlived his friends, his immediate family. His day had long since gone by. He had given generously to hospitals and charitable institutions and a number of personal presents. He always, for example, sent some of the large baskets of fruit the town's leading shop arranged so attractively to those he knew would never buy themselves such delicacies. The last Christmas, he had only received 2 presents, one from his nephew out west and another from a grandchild. He was waiting for these now. The postman came along the street. Eagerly, old Hiram waited, and then he got up and went to the door. But the postman had passed by. "Are you sure you have nothing for me?" he called out. "Look more carefully. I was expecting some packages." The postman looked again. "I'm sorry, Mr. Palmer, but there's nothing here." Slowly, Hiram went back into the lonely little house. He had lived too long, for his nephew had said, "I guess I won't bother with Uncle Hiram this year. It's a nuisance to shop, and anyway, what does he care about a necktie? He can buy all he wants." And his grandchild had said, "I've got to cut down on my Christmas list. It's too long." And she had run her pencil through her grandfather's name, for she had said, "Christmas is for young people. He's too old to care about presents and a handkerchief or 2, which I might send him." And that is the end of that little story, which conveys kind of a simple message to never forget about people and how important your little Christmas gift in the mail might be to them. And this is the final piece that I'm going to read from the Owasso Times, December 23rd, 1921 edition, and it's a short poem called Christmas. When Ma begins to tiptoe round, in we begin to hear a certain hushy whispering sound. About this time o' year, we know that she and Santa Claus are fixing things to do, and we never peep because they never want us to. When all the seats in Sunday school are filled with girls and boys, and no one ever breaks a rule or makes a bit of noise, we know it can't be very long till Santy will appear and pass his presents to the throng that comes but once a year. When Aunt Melindy comes and brings the children in the bird, and she makes popcorn strings, we never say a word, but anybody order see that she has come to stay till time to have a Christmas tree, which can't be far away. And it was signed The King's Messenger. It's kind of a very interesting tongue twister of a poem. And the last piece that I'm going to share with you from the year 1921 was published on December 10th in the Ironwood, Michigan newspaper called the Daily Globe. And they were not necessarily publishing a piece of a story or a poem, but they were making an appeal for people to join the Alias Santa Club. And they had this great little article in a newspaper, and essentially it was an appeal for people to become members of the Alias Santa Claus Club, in which they would take Christmas letters that were sent into the newspaper by children who otherwise would not have gotten any kind of Christmas presents. And they had this simple coupon that all you had to do was fill out that I will be Santa Claus to blank children. You put the number of children in there, and please send me their names, ages, and addresses. And then you signed it and you gave your address and you mailed in this coupon to the alias Santa Claus Club at the editor of the Daily Globe, and they would send to you the letters that you requested. And in addition to the article that they put in there, as well as the coupon on the front page, there was this really great cartoon graphic that says, "Let's all be merry this year." And there's a man reading a newspaper in the first frame, and he says, "I don't know what's the matter with me. I just can't get that Christmas feeling anymore." And then he's looking in the paper and he says, "Whoop, that's my big chance." And it points to the ad, alias Santa Claus coupon. And then in the final frame, he's seen bringing a basket of toys to a bunch of children and holding a sled. And the children are saying, "Hooray! Santa didn't forget us after all." And that was really the simple message of that whole program, run by the Daily Globe. And it was run in December 1921. And this is in Ironwood, Michigan, which is in the Upper Peninsula. So I thought that was quite something, and I really wanted to share that story with you. Perhaps it will inspire others to form a similar Santa Claus Club or alias Santa Claus Club in the future. On December 23rd, 1922, in the Marshall Evening Chronicle, on the front page, was this article called "A Creed for Christmas," and it reads, "I believe in Santa Claus. I believe that there is reality in the spirit which rules the minds of the little folks from one Christmastide to the other. I believe that the twinkle of the bells on the reindeer-drawn sleigh of the little man in red is the most beautiful music we can hear. I believe that there is nothing finer, nothing better for America, and nothing better for the welfare of all mankind than the privilege Christmas gives us for the bringing a smile, a laugh, a warm heart to some little child whose faith in Santa Claus constitutes one of the most wholesome standards for the growth of a strong and loving race. I believe that no greater happiness is possible than that which will result from a daily endeavor to be like Santa Claus after the eventful night when he makes his silent, unseen visit to the four sides of this land. I believe that the love, the generosity, and the heart full of kindness that make up the character of that jolliest fellow in the world are the best of their kind. I believe that the more we all try to be like Santa Claus, the better our lives will be and the happier will be the people with whom we come in contact. I believe that the faith of the children in Santa Claus is a good faith. I believe in Santa Claus. And I found that to be a very well-written, beautiful message that certainly should be remembered. Moving back to the Upper Peninsula, we arrive at a story published on December 24th, 1922 in the Escanaba Daily Press. And the story is called "The Squirrel's Christmas," and it was written by Martha B. Thomas. "My dear," said Mrs. Squirrel to her husband on Christmas morning, "do you realize that we have absolutely nothing in the cupboard?" Mr. Squirrel stroked his whiskers and gave a thoughtful flirt to his tail. "You remember that yesterday morning we gave those shiftless Chatterreds the very last nut we had," went on Mrs. Squirrel, putting her paws in her apron pockets, a very bad sign. "I assure you it meant that something was going to be done, and done quickly." Mr. Squirrel went on stroking his whiskers. This seemed the only reply he could muster. He knew the facts of the case as well as his wife. Hadn't he invited the Chatterreds in? Hadn't he felt sorry for them because they looked so cold and hungry? Didn't he know that all fall, when the nuts were thickest, the Chatterreds had frolicked instead of getting in their winter supply? Didn't he caution them 100 times, and hadn't they been rather saucy about it? They had, and yet the day before Christmas they looked so forlorn he couldn't bear it. How they had lived as long as they had was something he did not like to think about. So in they trooped, 5 of them. They had very little, and their noses quivered expectantly. The youngest of them, Charlie Chatterred, began to whimper. They could not stop him. At last, he said it right out loud. He said, and the tears rolled down his little cheeks like marbles spilled out of a boy's pocket, "I'm so hungry. I haven't had a thing to eat for 2 days." And then he buried his head in his mother's lap and howled. It was all very sad. Mr. Squirrel had a consultation with his wife. They went into a corner to talk it over. When you yourself have just one nut left the day before Christmas, it takes a long time to decide to give it away. One of the reasons they had just one nut left was for the fact that some weeks past, they had been helping those same shiftless Chattereds, but Mrs. Squirrel was very kind in spite of her sharp tongue, and she said that she supposed it was their Christian duty to help out unto 70 times 7. So the last nut, a fine fat one it was too, was brought forth. Mr. Chattered almost bowed himself in two with gratitude, and all the little Chattereds danced around like Indians. They whirled up so much dust in Mrs. Squirrel's living room that everyone began to sneeze. And at last they went home, and Mr. and Mrs. Squirrel stood and looked at one another. They had said nothing at all. And here it was Christmas, and nothing in the cupboard. "At last we can be thankful we have no children," said Mr. Squirrel. "They wouldn't have to go hungry on Christmas Day." Mrs. Squirrel had nothing but a snort in answer to this. Mr. Squirrel crossed the room and stood looking out of the window. The landscape was not very cheerful. Gray sky, bare leaves, and a cold wind that made one shiver just to hear it. A Christmas indeed. Mrs. Squirrel still had her paws in her apron pockets. She seemed to be thinking very hard. The harder she thought, the more she cocked her head on one side. She actually seemed in danger of bending it so far it would break off. Then the idea came. Back snapped her head. Out came her hands from her apron pockets. Over to Mr. Squirrel she marched and nudged him with her elbow. "My dear," she said, "I have a thought of something." "What is it?" demanded Mr. Squirrel, whirling about. "Put on your best coat, polish up your shoes, take your silver-headed cane, and we'll go for a walk on Christmas morning." "But Sabrina," which was Mrs. Squirrel's name, he protested, "I really can't see what taking a walk has to do with getting anything to eat." "You begin to get on your coat and shoes, and I'll tell you," answered Mrs. Squirrel. She whisked about like a girl. You could not believe that she could be so spry. While she was tying on her bonnet under her chin, she told her plan to Mr. Squirrel. Sandy, which was Mr. Squirrel's name, "The children living in the big house across the road always have a stocking full of good things on Christmas morning. I have seen them come out and scatter crumbs to the birds and tie bits of suet on the twigs of the trees. Perhaps if we went walking by, they would throw us some nuts. We don't care to beg, but it is only fair that they who have so much and are so kind-hearted should spare us a little on Christmas morning." Mr. Squirrel thought this an excellent plan, and gave his shoes such an extra polishing that they nearly put his eyes out. It all happened just as they had hoped. When they approached the big house across the road, there were the children outdoors scattering crumbs and grain. One boy was climbing a tree with a bit of suet tied to a string in his hand. There was a good deal of shouting and laughing going on, and to tell the truth, the squirrels were a little bit timid. But when one is hungry, it does not pay to be afraid. Soon as the children caught sight of them, they shouted louder than ever. "Oh, oh," they cried, "see Mr. and Mrs. Squirrel, how nice they look. Let's give them some nuts." And if you will believe me, those generous boys and girls that lived in the house across the road poured out such bags of nuts and goodies that Mr. and Mrs. Squirrel were busy the rest of the morning taking them home. And they asked the Chattereds to join them and fill up their larder too. So everyone had a Merry Christmas, and Mrs. Squirrel did not have to put her hands into her apron pockets for months and months. And that is the end of that fun little story. On December 24th, 1925, in the Traverse City Record-Eagle, there was an article about an interview with Henry Ford, and he described that the first fiddle that he received was his most vivid Christmas memory. A $1 violin given to Henry Ford by his mother when he was 10 years old is the automobile magnate's most vivid recollection of Christmas in his youth. It was just what I wanted, and on it I learned to play my first tune, he said, in an interview to the United Press. The violin came to Ford on Christmas in 1873. When he left home later in life, it was hanging on a peg in the woodshed. Still later, the son of a neighbor, knowing Ford was making a collection of violins, gave him what he said was the old violin which once hung in the Ford woodshed. Ford believes it is the same instrument and now keeps it with his priceless collection of famous violins. Other memories, Ford said, included a shining pair of ice skates with high curved toes adorned with acorns. They were wooden tops with straps, he said, and describing them. Screws fitted into a hole in the heel of the shoe, and two pyramid-shaped points just back of it kept the skate slipping off the foot. On the night before Christmas, members of the family always hung their stockings either from a mantel or fireplace or on a chair. The big time came on Christmas Day. And so that was how he described his early childhood and his earliest Christmas memory, and I thought that was a really special story to include here. In the Escanaba Daily Press of December 16th, 1925, there was an article that was written by Mary Graham Bonner, who is a lady I've shared a couple of pieces in my collection of Christmas stories already, and this article was called Many Words That Add to Christmas Season, and she says, words come to our lips so easily that we do not always appreciate how glorious some of them are and how much they mean to us. Think of the words that add to the Christmas season. Every one of them has a significance and a Christmas meaning of its own. There are green and there are ribbons. There are gifts and there is Yuletide. There is sleigh and there is snow. There are bells and there is cheer. There is the bright fire and the frosty air. There are sleds and sunshine on the snow and the glow of a Christmas afternoon. There is happiness and there are candles, and there are wreaths and holly and mistletoe. There is Santa Claus for the children, and friendly voices wishing one and all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. There is the postman, and there is a small child by the old chimney. There is a plum pudding and a mince pie and turkey and cranberry. There is the Christmas tree and children talking of reindeer. There is tinsel and there is holiday candy. There are stockings and there are Christmas decorations. There are surprises and there are excitements. And all of these things have such beautiful sounds. The words themselves are so wonderful. They mean so much. No other words would be the same. And best of all is the word Christmas. It is the year's most glorious word. Mary Graham Bonner. This next story was published in the Saline Observer on December 26, 1929. It's called Home at Christmas, and it was written by Catherine Elderman, and it was originally published in 1928. It reads, "What a joy it is to come home at Christmas. What delightful anticipation the very thought of it brings during the busy, happy weeks that come before. In the street, in the office or shop, or wherever we are during this time, our hearts warm at the joy of all that it will mean. What pleasure to listen as the train thunders its way across the miles, to know that each moment we are drawing nearer and nearer to the old home place. What thrills surge over us as we think of the gifts that we are carrying home and the joy of handing them to those we love. What a rush of love and tenderness fills us as we think of the happy meeting that lies ahead, of the warmth at the welcome that awaits us and the joy that our coming will bring. What if it was hard to get away? What though it entailed sacrifice and expense? Is not 1 hour of its gladness worth the price? Will not the memory of it cheer us over and over in the days that are coming, a shining pearl upon our chain of remembrance? Is it good to come home at all times? And cold, indeed, it is the heart that does not respond to its thrill. But to come home at Christmas when bells are ringing, when heart is calling to heart across the miles, when the ties of home and kin have grown deeper and dearer, that is a happiness beyond all telling. To miss it for some small reason is to deprive ourselves of one of life's greatest joys. And that is a very special and beautiful message. And that, my friends, is the last story that I'm going to share in this video. I hope you enjoyed these stories. It was a lot of fun putting this one together. I originally had planned to only do one video this year on Christmas. But when I came across this batch of stories in this decade, I decided I had to put in the extra time to really make this possible, to have it come out on Christmas Day, because it is a special collection of stories and they're quite wonderful. So I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did in producing them and reading them and finding them. And if you liked this video, please take a minute, hit the like button down there, and certainly subscribe to the channel and share the video with others. And thank you very much for watching, and I wish you all a very Merry Christmas.